Every night, a small dog with shaggy fur curled up just outside the gates of Oakwood Animal Shelter. Despite the cold winter nights, he never sought shelter or food. Instead, the little dog sat by the entrance, staring intently at the door, as though waiting for someone. Clara Jenkins, a veterinarian known for her no-nonsense attitude and deep compassion for animals, noticed the puppy one chilly evening as she left the shelter after a long day. At first, she dismissed it, but something about the dog's constant presence caught her attention. "What's he doing here?" Clara mumbled to herself, stopping in her tracks. A shelter worker passing by overheard her. "That dog has been here every night for weeks," she said. "Poor thing. He's probably waiting for someone." Clara felt a twinge of sympathy. The dog's eyes were sad, as if they were telling a story of abandonment, loss, or longing. Clara couldn't help but wonder what it was. The next night, as Clara was leaving the shelter again, she noticed the same dog, still sitting at the same spot, his fur matted with snowflakes that had fallen through the evening. Despite the frigid air, he remained perfectly still, focused on the entrance. Clara hesitated. She wasn't one to get emotional over animals. It was her job to care for them. But there was something about this dog that tugged at her heartstrings. Slowly, she approached. "You're still here?" Clara said softly, her breath fogging up in the cold night. The dog's ears twitched, but he didn't move. His gaze remained fixed on the shelter. "Do you have an owner?" Clara whispered. The dog didn't respond, but his eyes seemed to communicate something, like they were filled with an unspoken plea. Just then, a janitor walked by with a broom. "Talking to that dog again, huh?" he joked. "He's been out here every night. Some people think he's waiting for a former owner, someone who used to bring him here." Clara looked back at the shelter. Could it be that the dog's owner was inside? Or worse, had they already passed, leaving the dog to wait outside, alone and confused? For the next few nights, Clara couldn't shake the thought of the dog. Every time she left the shelter, he was there, watching. It was as if he were waiting for someone who might never come back. Clara couldn't help but wonder who it was, or why he was so dedicated to waiting. One particularly cold night, Clara brought a small blanket from her car and draped it over the dog. "Here," she said, her voice soft. "This should help." To her surprise, the dog didn't pull away. His trusting eyes met hers for a brief moment before he returned his gaze to the shelter doors. Clara felt a lump form in her throat. Why was this little dog so loyal to a place that wasn't his home? Was he waiting for someone? Or had he lost something, someone, that he was too scared to let go of? The next morning, Clara took action. During her lunch break, she asked the receptionist at the shelter, "Has anyone reported a missing dog? Maybe this one belongs to a former owner?" The receptionist shook her head. "No reports, Clara. Not that I know of. He just showed up here one day and hasn't left." Clara's curiosity deepened. She couldn't just let the mystery linger. She started leaving food and water for the dog each night. She noticed that the bowls were always empty by morning, but the dog remained steadfast in his vigil. He never begged or barked. He simply waited. One evening, as Clara got into her car to head home, she saw the dog in his usual spot. "Why won't you leave?" Clara muttered, frustration creeping into her voice. It wasn't frustration with the dog, but with herself. She felt helpless. How could she help a dog who was so determined to wait for someone or something she couldn't provide? The next weekend, Clara's routine was disrupted. As she approached the shelter's entrance, she saw a group of shelter workers gathered around the dog. One of them, a kind-hearted volunteer named Emma, was gently petting the dog's head. "He finally let someone pet him," Emma said, smiling. "He's starting to trust us, I think." Clara knelt down, her hand hovering over the dog's fur. "Is that true, buddy? Are you warming up to us?" she asked gently. To her surprise, the dog didn't shy away. He looked up at Clara, his eyes filled with both hope and sadness. In that moment, Clara knew she couldn't ignore the dog any longer. She had to find out why he was waiting. Who was he waiting for? The next morning, Clara arrived at the shelter early. She had spent the night thinking about the dog. Why was he still here? Who was he waiting for? And what could she do to help? Clara went straight to the front desk. Has anyone asked about a missing dog? She asked, her voice filled with urgency. The receptionist shook her head. No reports, Clara. It's like the dog just appeared and made this place his home. Clara sighed, glancing out toward the entrance where the dog waited. The idea of leaving the mystery unsolved bothered her, so she decided to take matters into her own hands. After finishing her rounds, she approached Emma, the volunteer who had connected with the dog. I think we need to do more, Clara said. This dog isn't just here by accident. There's something important about him. Emma raised an eyebrow. You really care about him, don't you? She asked, her tone soft. Clara hesitated, then nodded. I can't explain it, but I feel like we're missing something. Emma smiled. I have a friend at the local animal shelter. Maybe they can help us check if he's microchipped. Let's do it, Clara agreed. That evening, Emma gently attached a leash to the dog and coaxed him inside. To everyone's surprise, the puppy followed without resistance, though his small body trembled slightly. At the shelter, the technician scanned the dog for a microchip. Nothing, the technician said, frowning. He's not chipped. Clara clenched her jaw. So now what? We could post his picture online, Emma suggested. See if anyone recognizes him. The technician agreed, snapping a photo of the dog and posting it to local community boards and social media. If he has an owner, they'll see this, the technician assured them. Clara nodded, but deep down, she wasn't convinced. If the dog had an owner, why hadn't anyone come looking for him? Days passed without any new information, and Clara found herself spending more time with the dog. Though she hadn't brought him home, she couldn't help but feel attached to him. His quiet presence became oddly comforting. One evening, as Clara sat on the steps with the dog, she spoke aloud, as if sharing her thoughts. I never really understood loyalty until I met you, she said softly. My job, it's all about fixing things, moving on. But you're still here no matter what. The dog tilted his head slightly, as if listening. Clara smiled, then looked into the puppy's eyes, which seemed to hold an ocean of emotions: hope, sadness, loyalty. Who are you waiting for? She whispered. The mystery deepened the next day when Clara overheard a conversation between two elderly visitors to the shelter. That dog reminds me of a story, one of them said softly. I heard of a dog who waited outside a train station for years, waiting for his owner, who had passed away. Clara froze. Could that be what was happening here? Had the dog's owner passed away, leaving him to wait alone? Determined to find out, Clara asked Emma to help her search through patient records at the shelter. I know it's a long shot, Clara said, but what if the dog's owner was once here and never made it out? After hours of searching, Emma finally found something. Look at this, Emma said, pointing to a file. An elderly man named Henry Donovan. He was admitted 3 weeks ago after a heart attack. Clara's heart skipped a beat as she leaned in to read the file more closely. Henry Donovan. The name rang a bell. She had seen it before, in the shelter's adoption history. Henry had adopted a dog several years ago, a small, scrappy puppy with shaggy fur, just like the one who had been waiting outside every night. Clara's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages. The man had been a regular visitor to the shelter, coming in to volunteer and support the animals. According to the notes, Henry had passed away a little over 3 weeks ago in the hospital. There was no mention of the dog being returned or adopted out after his death. It makes sense, Clara murmured, her voice tinged with sadness. The dog. He's waiting for him. His owner never came back. Emma nodded solemnly. I think he's been waiting here ever since, thinking his person would return. Clara stood up, her heart heavy with the weight of the discovery. But what now? What happens to him? Emma placed a comforting hand on Clara's shoulder. Maybe we can help him move on, help him heal from his loss. Clara nodded, but a wave of uncertainty passed over her. She couldn't help but feel that the little dog's journey was far from over. There was something more at play here, something deep within the dog's loyalty and persistence. She knew she couldn't just let him sit and wait forever, but how could she help him let go of the past? As Clara walked back outside, she found the dog still waiting at the entrance of the shelter. The snow had started to fall more heavily now, but he remained undeterred, his eyes fixed on the door. Clara knelt down in front of him, offering her hand. The dog looked up at her, his expression a mixture of wariness and hope. "Hey there," she whispered, stroking his matted fur gently. "You don't have to wait anymore." The dog's eyes softened, and for the first time in weeks, he didn't pull away from her touch. He leaned into her, the warmth of his small body a stark contrast to the frigid air. Clara felt a sense of peace settle over her, knowing that the dog was finally allowing himself to trust again. In the days that followed, Clara dedicated more time to helping the dog find comfort in his new life. She named him Oliver, a symbol of hope for the little dog who had waited so long for someone who would never return. She began working with him every day, helping him adjust to his new routine and introducing him to the other animals at the shelter. Slowly but surely, Oliver began to open up. He played with other dogs, and even though he still had moments of hesitation, Clara could see the trust growing between them. She knew the road ahead would be long, but she was determined to help him heal. And one evening, as Clara sat by Oliver's side, watching the sunset together, she whispered, "You may have been waiting for him, but I think it's time to start a new chapter. You're not alone anymore, Oliver. I'll be here for you." In the weeks that followed, Clara found that the little dog had transformed. He no longer waited by the gates in silent vigil. Instead, he had found a new place in the shelter, surrounded by love, trust, and a future filled with hope. Oliver may have been waiting for his owner for so long, but now he had a chance to live again, not in the shadow of the past, but in the warmth of a new beginning. And as Clara watched him run around the yard with the other dogs, she couldn't help but feel that, just like the animals she cared for, she had found something she hadn't known she was waiting for all along, a reminder of the power of loyalty, love, and second chances. The days turned into weeks, and Oliver's transformation was nothing short of miraculous. He went from a small dog with a distant, broken gaze to one that ran freely, wagging his tail with joy. Clara had come to realize that healing wasn't a linear path, and Oliver had his moments of retreat, but each day brought new signs of his willingness to trust again. One particularly cold morning, Clara walked into the shelter to find Oliver sitting by the door. This time, he wasn't staring out toward the entrance. Instead, he was watching her with those same, soulful eyes, as if to say, "I'm ready." Clara smiled softly. She had become more than just a caretaker to Oliver. Over the weeks, they had built a bond that was unspoken but deeply felt. He had become a part of her life in a way that was undeniable. But there was still something inside her that felt she needed to give him a permanent home, not just in the shelter, but in her own heart and life. "Well, what do you say, Oliver?" Clara asked, crouching beside him. He tilted his head, his eyes softening as he looked up at her, and for a moment, the world outside seemed to disappear. She had always been cautious about bringing a dog into her home. Her job was demanding, and the responsibility of a pet was something she didn't take lightly. But Oliver was different. He had been waiting for so long, and now, it felt like she was the one who had been waiting for him too. The connection between them was undeniable. "I think you've earned a new start," Clara said, rubbing his ears. "What do you think? You ready for a new home?" Oliver's tail wagged slowly, but Clara could see the hesitance in his eyes, as if he was still processing the idea. It made sense. After all, he had been waiting for someone else for so long. But Clara knew that sometimes the hardest part of healing wasn't just letting go of the past, it was trusting that the future could be just as good. Clara took a deep breath, her heart racing. "Let's give it a try, Oliver. One step at a time." Later that day, Clara took Oliver home. She set up a cozy bed for him by the fireplace and placed a bowl of water beside it. She wasn't sure how he would react to his new surroundings, but she was determined to make him feel safe. At first, Oliver was uncertain. He sniffed around the house, exploring every corner with a cautious but curious demeanor. He didn't venture too far from Clara, though, staying close to her wherever she went. That night, Clara settled on the couch, and Oliver hesitated for a moment before curling up at her feet. Clara smiled, feeling the warmth of the moment settle over her. She had given him a chance to move on, but it was clear that they still had a long road ahead. And she was ready for it. Over the next few months, Oliver began to show more and more of his personality. He became more playful, though still a little reserved around new people. But at home, with Clara, he blossomed. His once somber eyes sparkled with energy as he chased after toys or curled up beside Clara on the couch during lazy evenings. One evening, Clara was sitting at the kitchen table when she heard a faint sound, a soft whimper from the living room. She rushed in to find Oliver, his eyes wide and filled with confusion as he pawed at the window. Curious, Clara followed his gaze and froze. Outside, under the dim streetlight, she could just make out a figure, a man, standing in the snow, looking toward the house. Clara's heart skipped a beat. The figure was familiar, too familiar. It was Henry Donovan. She blinked, not believing her eyes. The man she had seen in the shelter's records, the one who had once owned Oliver, was standing there in front of her home. Oliver whined softly and ran to the door, paws skittering against the hardwood floor. Clara opened the door, her heart racing. The man outside didn't move at first. He was standing still, his face a mixture of sorrow and wonder. "Is it really you, boy?" Henry whispered, his voice raspy. Clara stood frozen, her mind reeling. She had thought Henry Donovan had passed away. Was this a ghost? A vision? But before she could gather her thoughts, Oliver bounded outside, running toward the man with a speed and joy Clara had never seen before. The dog stopped just short of him, looking up at Henry with bright, eager eyes. For a long moment, the two stood in silence, man and dog reunited. Henry knelt down slowly, his hands trembling as he reached out to pet Oliver. The dog leaned into his touch, a sense of peace washing over him as if everything he had been waiting for had finally come to pass. Clara took a cautious step forward. "Henry," she asked, her voice shaking. You're alive?" Henry's eyes met hers, filled with the weight of 1,000 emotions. I don't know how to explain this. I was in the hospital, and I didn't know what happened to him. I thought I was going to die, and I didn't want him to be alone. I couldn't bear the thought of him waiting by himself. Clara was stunned, but there was something in Henry's voice that told her this was the truth. "But why didn't you come back sooner?" she asked. Henry looked down at Oliver, his eyes full of regret. "I've been in a care facility, recovering. I was too weak to walk, to do anything. But I never forgot about him. I thought about him every day. I just didn't know if he was still out there, waiting for me." Clara swallowed hard, her heart conflicted. She had never expected this twist in the story. She had become Oliver's guardian, his second chance, and now she was faced with the truth. The man who had loved him so deeply was alive and standing right in front of them. "Oliver," Clara whispered, looking down at the dog. He had stopped wagging his tail and was staring at her, as if sensing her dilemma. His gaze shifted to Henry, then back to Clara. "Do you want to go home with him?" Clara asked softly, her voice barely a whisper. The dog seemed to hesitate, his body trembling as he looked between the two people who had loved him. And then, slowly, he moved toward Henry, resting his head against the man's leg. Clara's heart broke, but she knew that Oliver had found his way back to the person who had loved him first. As much as she had come to care for him, she understood that some bonds were too deep to be broken. "Go ahead, buddy," Clara said, her voice thick with emotion. "Go home." As Henry hugged Oliver tightly, tears welling in his eyes, Clara stepped back, watching the reunion with bittersweet joy. She had helped Oliver heal, but sometimes love meant letting go. It meant giving someone the chance to find their way back to the person who had never truly left. And as Clara turned back to her house, she knew that Oliver's journey had come full circle. He had waited, and now he was truly home. Clara stood there for a long moment, watching Henry and Oliver embrace, before she slowly retreated inside, her heart full of conflicting emotions. She had given so much of herself to help Oliver heal, but seeing the bond between him and Henry reaffirmed the truth she had known all along. Love was about letting go, even when it was painful. She sank into her couch, her thoughts racing. What did this mean for her? For the future? It was the first time in a long while that Clara felt unsure. She had always been the one to fix things, to help animals heal. But now, standing on the other side of that process, she had to reckon with the fact that some things couldn't be fixed in the way she wanted. Some things, like Oliver's love and loyalty, had always been there, just waiting to be reunited. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her reverie. She glanced down to see a text from Emma, the volunteer who had been so kind to Oliver. Just wanted to check in. How's he doing? Is he adjusting okay? Clara smiled at the message, grateful for Emma's concern. But it was clear now that Oliver's journey wasn't hers to oversee anymore. It had always been about him finding peace and trust again. And now he had. Clara quickly typed a response. He's with Henry. It's been quite a day, but I think they both needed it. He's home now. A few seconds later, Emma replied, I'm so glad. You did great with him, Clara. You gave him the chance to heal. Clara read the message and felt a sense of closure wash over her. She had done all she could, and now it was time to let go. It wasn't about fixing the dog or rescuing him. It was about providing him with the space to heal and find his way back to what he had lost. And in doing so, Clara had unknowingly healed herself as well. The next day, Clara returned to the shelter. The air was crisp, but there was a lightness to her step. She knew that the work would continue. The animals would always need care, and there would be more cases like Oliver's. But there was something different in the way she approached her job now. She had seen the full arc of a story, from uncertainty and pain to healing and reunion. It reminded her that no matter how hard or impossible it seemed, sometimes the best thing to do was to trust the journey. As she walked into the shelter, she noticed the empty spot by the door where Oliver used to sit. It felt strange at first, but then Clara smiled softly. She knew he had found his place, and that was all that mattered. Later that evening, Clara sat down with a cup of tea, looking out the window at the soft winter snowfall. She thought of Oliver and Henry, wondering what their life together would look like from here on out. And in that quiet moment, Clara realized something profound. Some stories, like the one she had shared with Oliver, didn't end in the way you expected. But they were still beautiful, still meaningful. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.